If, based on the URL, it senses that it's supposed to be running a plugin, it will then reroute to run the plugin. Otherwise, it will route to the things that it's supposed to do. And in this case, since we're looking for a regular old page, in this case home, it will attempt to load some content from a place, a known place in the file tree, and load some content from the database. Assuming it finds content in one or both places, we'll set some more things like templates, what theme to use. It'll grab the content, grab what the page title ought to be, set all those things. And if the request is AJAX, it'll shove all the pertinent data that that the system's default AJAX-y type handler will be looking for into a JSON object and shoves it back. If it is not an AJAX call, it will run it through the asset manager, which will grab it will find the right theme, it will load up the template, it will gather all the JavaScripts and CSS files that you have called along the way, and concatenate and minify the JavaScript. It will concatenate and sort of minify the CSS. And put them both either at the top or at the bottom, depending on which one it is. Then it will optionally save those things off into cached versions, and then serve up the HTML. And that's how we end up with this thing here. With our our CSS files all lined up at the top here, and JavaScripts all lined up at the bottom here. You can see they are being served from static.makerator, the URL, instead of just the regular URL that the page itself is doing. This is an option that Makerator allows us for. It senses things, images, JavaScripts, all those type of assets, and sorts them from a domain that Lasso doesn't handle in order to allow for much longer caching on those types of things than you would want from your HTML pages or especially pages with dynamic data. And then you could also, using this, save those sorts of things up to a CDN, like Amazon S3 or those sorts of things, and then serve them from the cloud. You can see what this is not doing right now is the concatenation and minifying. And that's because I haven't gotten it turned on. I'll show you that. Okay. The site config file lets you override the system's defaults. Here I've told it what I want the default domain name to be. And then down here, I'm also catching that if it is if it is not the default domain name, or any others that I've told it can explicitly handle, to redirect to the default domain name. Right. We set things like what database to look for, what theme and template to use. We set up our Lasso security authentication and those sorts of things. That runs through the site config, which will then load up the asset manager initialization routine. System. I think it looked right. There is one in the system. If you place one in site, it will override the one in the system. That way there is one by default, but you can set one explicitly. And that is true for nearly everything in Makerator. Option-wise, it has lots and lots of defaults, and a default system that doesn't load them up until you call them. If you try and call an option that is one of the defaults, you can just call the default and it will then create. But if you try and use one of those options and you haven't created it yet, it will create it for you first of all. So anyway, in this case, I set the asset manager to not use the cache, and to not minify, and to not compress. Let's, whoops. Oh boy, Z is missing. Oh, that's Bob, sorry. You can, I set this up and then forgot I set it up this way. You can, in site config, and you can do this anyway in all of your code, but you can have different settings based on your domain name, of course. Awesome. That's just fantastic. Everything's just a little bit different here. All right, well, skip it.